Thank you all for joining. This is the 5th installment of the Landscape Summit. I'm Michael Dukes with the Center for Land Use Efficiency. We're happy to host this. We've had a variety of topics for those of you who are returning. And today, I think this topic is a natural progression on landscape design. And we have two of our folks here. We've got Dr. Gail Hansen. She's an associate professor of sustainable landscape design in the Environmental Horticulture Department here at UF-IFAS. Her teaching and extension programs address sustainable, science-based, and art-centered design that takes into account social dimension of green urban environments, environmental protection, and quality of life for urban dwellers. She has a PhD in landscape architecture from UF, and she practiced in private practice as a landscape architect for a number of years. Also, we have Dr. Taylor Clem. Taylor is an Alachua County environmental and community hort agent. He's going to tell us more, but I think that involves Florida-friendly landscaping to a large degree. And he has a PhD in horticulture from UF, and Dr. Hansen was his major advisor. So with that, Gail, you have the floor.
Okay, well, thanks for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Put it in. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, we'll start from the beginning here rather than the last slide. Hide these floating meeting controls. Okay, well, thank you again for that introduction and welcome everyone. As you know, the theme for this year's summit is about innovations in landscapes. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that I'm working on with the Florida-friendly landscaping program on future Florida-friendly residential landscapes. And if you're a member of the center, you know that we have been meeting for, I think, a little over 2 years now, and we've been discussing future urban landscapes. And the reason why it's been taking us so long, 2 years worth of discussions, is because urban landscapes are really complicated. You have to take into account both the social and the economic issues with urban landscapes, and also the very different environmental conditions that you will encounter in urban areas. So at the same time that we have been having these meetings and these discussions, I've also been working with Claire Lewis and Jen Marvin from the Florida Friendly program. And we've been writing a book, in the process of writing a book on landscape styles for Florida Friendly residential landscapes. And these meetings that we've been having in CLU have really influenced our thinking and kind of changed our thinking about residential landscapes. And we decided that we needed to think a little bit more, come up with a process where we could link Florida-friendly principles with landscape function and landscape styles. Excuse me, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is that process. But there's actually a couple of things that we need to remember about urban residential landscapes before I talk about that process. And one of them is that residential yards are very understudied and underappreciated, particularly as an ecosystem. One of the reasons why they're understudied is because it's really hard to find homeowners who will let you onto their property and let you tinker around with their landscape so you can do your studies. And the other reason that they're understudied is because there are so many different types of residential landscapes. And you see these two photos here, they represent some very different residential landscapes. So it's very hard to just study a few landscapes and then generalize what you have learned about that to all residential landscapes. They're also underappreciated as an ecosystem, and actually that kind of depends on how you define ecosystem, but they have the huge potential to be a high functioning ecosystem. Another reason why they're not studied much is because they're very small, but they do have a high impact on humans and on the environment. So it's something that we should study more and learn more about. One of the reasons why we're having all the discussions in the CLUE meetings is because we recognize that they have a high impact on the environment and that we need to change some of the things that we do in our residential landscapes. They have a high impact on humans because they involve the social aspect. They are tied up with property value, with social norms, fitting in with the neighborhood and so forth. We also know that residential landscapes, when you're talking about types of landscape, not total land coverage in a city, but just different types of landscapes. So for example, parks, residential, schoolyards, road right-of-ways and so forth, that residential yards are about 35% of the total landscapes in cities. So that's quite a bit of green space that we can have an influence on when we're talking about Florida-friendly designs and landscapes. So there's another really important thing that you have to think about when you're talking about residential design is they are novel landscapes, sometimes known as novel plant communities, which means they're man-made, pretty much totally man-made. They're made by people and for people. So people make the decision on what different plants they're going to use, plant selection. They make the decision on how they're going to arrange the plants, how that landscape is going to be used. So what that means is you're going to have these entirely new species combinations in a landscape. And every yard is going to be different because the owner or the designer is the one who's choosing those. And so there's going to be hundreds of different combinations of different plant material. What's questionable about them is the ecosystem function, but we know that they have the potential to have high functioning ecosystems. And we also know that there are almost always a combination of native, near native, and non-native plants. So these are called adapted plants, which means that they do well in the environment. And they can be, this combination of these plants can be compatible with an ecological approach if we do it right. So that's the key here. We have to really think about our plant combinations and design them in the right way. I put this particular picture in here just as an example of what a novel landscape could be. This is actually a man-made wetland. So obviously it doesn't look like the natural wetland. It is designed with terraces for water to flow through plant material. The plant material was selected specifically to help clean and filter the water. It has a pond in it, which looks more like a swimming pool than a pond. But this particular landscape is high functioning. It supports a lot of animals, a lot of insects. It has a good combination of plant material, and it does have the goal, reach the goal of cleaning water, which is one of the purposes or what happens in a natural wetland. So those two things to think about. We don't know a whole lot about residential landscapes and their novel landscapes. So the project that I have been working on with Jan Marvin and Claire Lewis in the Florida Friendly program is to write a book on landscape styles for residential landscapes. So Jan and Claire and I all have our background in landscape architecture. We went to school together and we've all worked in private practice. So initially our thinking was, okay, let's just write a book on landscape styles. And we came up with a list of like 22 different styles here: traditional PUD, which is planned unit development, a low cost landscape, a pollinator landscape, contemporary landscape. And we thought, well, this is going to be pretty easy. We're just going to do a design for each one, and then people can look at it and they can see what a Florida friendly landscape is going to look like. Part of the reason for us writing this book was because we always get that question when we talk about Florida friendly landscapes, and people say, well, what does it look like? They're really hesitant to adopt a Florida friendly landscape if they don't know what it's going to look like. And so we thought we had an easy task here, but the more we attended the CLUE meetings, the more we started thinking, we have to think beyond just a pretty landscape that, people are going to like the looks of it or the style of it. And we have to think about whether this in the future could be a high functioning Florida friendly landscape. So we kind of changed our whole thinking on what we were going to do in the book. And we went back to our roots. This is a book that was written in 1969 by Ian McHarg, a famous landscape architect, called Design by Nature. And he really changed the thinking of planners and designers. He pioneered the concept of ecological planning. It kind of flipped planning on its head. It was a whole new paradigm for design. It ushered in kind of the 1970s environmental decade where people were becoming very aware of what was happening in the environment because of human influence on it. That's when the EPA was established, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, all of that in the 1970s. So we were becoming much more aware of our impact on the environment, and he pioneered this use of kind of layering land use and natural systems. So this diagram on the right kind of explains that concept of layering. So where you separate out things like hydrology, vegetation, soil, topography, and then you insert layers of what people do, like green infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, buildings, roads, but also how people use the space or the land, how they move around in it, where they drive their cars and stuff like that. And his whole idea was you need to design with the ecology and character of the original landscape, and thinking about ecosystem and cultural system layers. So we kind of went back and we said, can we use this process of layers to help us kind of insert high functioning into our residential landscapes? So this is a diagram, and I'm going to explain a little more about what all these lines and arrows mean in here. But for now, you can kind of ignore those, and I'll talk about our process of how we went from just looking at Florida-friendly principles and into a way that we could design more high-functioning landscapes. So of course, we started with the 9 Florida-friendly principles, and everybody is, I'm sure, very familiar with those. And we said, okay, we need to think about some functional measures because we want this to be high functioning. What can we measure in the landscape? And how does it link back to these Florida-friendly principles? So a functional measure is sort of like a performance data. It has to be something that you can actually measure. So it has to be something that you can see, that you can observe, that you can attach a quantity to or a percent to, or some other way that you can measure it. So we went back into all of our books that we have, our documents, and chapters and books, articles, and so forth, and we came up with this list of functional measures that we think apply to residential landscapes. There's only 9 of them here, and just sort of by coincidence, we came up with 9 of them that, you know, kind of match the 9 Florida-friendly principles. But there is more functional measures, but we just kind of parsed out and looked at the ones that we thought were most important for residential design. So biodiversity, low maintenance, and that kind of falls under the economic sphere of sustainable landscapes, where you look at economics, social, and environmental. Conservation, and in particular, wildlife habitat. Water conservation, so saving water and looking at the health, the quality of water. Resilient to stressors, and that means that this particular landscape, especially now with climate change upon us, we are starting to see more effects of that, longer drought periods, you know, more intense storms. And so being resilient to stressors would mean, for example, you could look at it and say, how many trees, you know, came down in the storm, for example. Human habitat, so that falls under the social. Does this particular landscape serve human needs also? Looking at it being a useful and productive landscape rather than just a pretty landscape. Useful being, can we use it for recreation purposes? Productive, can we grow edibles in this landscape? High visual quality was really important, particularly for residential, because we know that that's, you know, when you are designing residential, the homeowner always asks for a pretty or nice landscape. I don't think anybody has ever had a homeowner ask for an ugly landscape, that's for sure. We also know it's important because studies have shown that people care more about and take better care of landscapes that are of high visual quality or aesthetically appealing. And then, of course, the big one, ecosystem services, and that is, you know, more the regional effect that if we look at all these other functions that we are going to improve the quality of ecosystem services. So one of the things that we did was we've got these two lists, and we said, now let's link every functional measure to each of the different FFL principles. So for example, right plant, right place, probably the most important principle in terms of design. And we said, okay, well, that relates to a lot of these different functional measures. It relates to biodiversity, low maintenance, wildlife habitat, conserving water. So if you follow each of the different, you know, yellow arrows there, you can see all the different functional measures that link to right plant, right place. And you just go down the list. Water efficiency links to low maintenance, because if you have plants that are drought tolerant, for example, and require low maintenance, they probably don't need as much water, but also water conservation and the health of the water. Another one, look all the way down on number 9, protect the waterfront. You can see it, that links to biodiversity, to wildlife habitat, resilience to stressors, human habitat, high visual quality, and ecosystem services. So we have these two lists, and we've got all our functional measures, and then we're like, okay, so what? What does this mean for a design? We know we can incorporate functional measures, we can link them to principles, but so what now? So then we took our functional measures and we said, and the little numbers in superscript there are the numbers of the different principles that all those functional measures link to. We took those functional measures and we went back and said, now we need a list of design strategies, and we need to link those back to these functional measures. So it's kind of an iterative process where we're going back and forth. So for biodiversity, for example, we need an appropriate plant palette. We also need to think about our percent of native or near native plants. For low maintenance, again, we need an appropriate plant palette. We also need to think about using sustainable hardscape and recycled materials. So by going back and forth between these functional measures and things that we need to think about in design, we came up with this list. It also includes the way that we organize plants, how we incorporate landform, how we manage water on the site, sustainable hardscapes, best irrigation design, and sense of place. And sense of place is really important because we need to think about where these landscapes are situated here in Florida. We want them to look like a Florida landscape. We don't want them to look like a landscape from the desert Southwest or, you know, up in the Northeast. So we had our list there, and then we said, okay, let's try this out on one of the Florida-friendly principles. Principle number 9, protect the waterfront. And let's see if we can come up with some very specific design actions that relate to our strategies and to our functional measures. So just a few of them here. Use landform to manage water. Use aquatic and shoreline plants on water bodies, meaning use the appropriate aquatic plants. Create wildlife habitat, use low input plants so that you don't have to put fertilizer, pesticides, and so forth on it, which would totally negate the whole purpose of having that buffer around a stormwater pond. And also to create a sense of place. So the illustration there is one that I did for another EDIS publication about designing for pollinator gardens. And it just illustrates how you can also, besides having this buffer here, you can also make it to be wildlife habitat by using the right plants. But you can also create a sense of place by using, Florida plants and make it a useful space where people can walk and enjoy the landscape. And then, we listed the functional measures that relate back to these design actions. So this is just a diagram of the step-by-step process that we are now using for each of our styles that we are writing about. And on this particular one, I'm going to use the managed natural style as an example of how we went through this process. So step number 1, pick your style. Step number 2, we just off the top of our head said, this is the look we want. So these are the things that we want in this landscape. We want a lot of plants. We want them to be mostly native. We want a very organic organization, so it looks natural. We want features for wildlife habitats, and then some details like a split rail fence, because that's kind of rustic looking. It'll fit in with a natural style, mulch pathways, and a wood deck. We know as designers what we want it to look like. So we wrote those down and we said, okay, let's relate those to our functional measures. So we looked at it and we said, okay, we've got biodiversity in here, low maintenance with an organized landscape. We're going to be able to conserve water because we have a lot of native plants. We've created human habitat because we have mulch pathways, we have a wood deck, and so on down the line. And then we said, okay, let's go back to our list of design strategies. Which strategies do we need to use to make this managed natural style? We need a variety of plants. A certain percent of them should be native. We need to include vertical layers if we're going to do that wildlife habitat. We need to manage our water. What are the best irrigation practices should we use? And then, of course, that sense of place. Once we had those design strategies, we looked back at the design features that we had come up with and we said, yeah, they match, so we're doing pretty good. And then we came up with our specific design actions. We said we need a plant palette that mimics nature. We need to organize our plants so they look natural but not messy, because that's what people don't like about really natural landscapes. And that's why we're calling it a managed natural landscape. We need to use repetition of plant material because that helps us organize, helps it to look more organized. We need ground cover, we need shrubs, we need small trees and large trees to get those vertical layers. Drip irrigation system would be the best one to use for this landscape. We have spaces for people, and we need to make sure our fences are open so we can encourage wildlife movement. So you can see that this is just a back and forth process. We go in circles with our steps, but then when we get to step number 2 and 5, it's a back and forth process. And eventually we get to that point where we know exactly what we want to put in our landscape. So this is what the pages of our book look like. The page for a managed natural landscape, we have a design description. We talk about using native and non-native plants, etc. We have the site metrics, and I'll talk about those in a minute. We have a picture to show them some character of what it might look like. But most importantly, we have our goals and our design tips in a text box there. And that's where we're talking about what we did and why we did it. So for example, we increased the variety of plant material to increase biodiversity. So that goes back to our, the way that we want to measure if this landscape is actually a high functioning landscape. We want it to be organized because it simplifies maintenance. We want viewing areas because it provides an opportunity to see wildlife. So in that text box is where we are telling the reader that these are the decisions we made and why we made them. And then we did our initial concept plan here. So this is just a rough draft of a plan for the managed natural landscape. Put down the plant types that we wanted, named our plants, showed the organization and everything. And in this particular plan, we have 11 different trees, but 7 different species. So that gives us good variety, 6 of which are native. We have 31 shrubs, Again, 7 species, only 2 of those are native. And we had 135 ground cover. Again, I don't know how this happened, just coincidence, 7 species, and 5 of those are native. So then we did a count. We said, okay, we've got 177 plants, 2/3 of them are native, 1/3 of them adapted. So do we need to change that ratio? Well, we thought about it and said, yeah, but we emphasized native trees. And from a trait-based biodiversity standpoint, trees have the most value. And so we thought, well, we've got almost all native trees. Maybe we're pretty good on that. The other issue is we wanted to put some common non-native ornamentals in there to create familiarity for our homeowners. So they could at least recognize some of the plants that we have in there and say, oh yeah, I get it. I know that plant. I know what it looks like. So I think this landscape is going to look nice. And then the other pages in the book, we have 3 sheets with our plant material schedule, one for North Florida, one for Central Florida, and one for South Florida. We have some notes on the plants. Then we have our final landscape plan. This is the one in black and white, but we have the color version of the final plan. And then we also did a character sheet. This particular sheet is characteristics of a drought-tolerant landscape, because I haven't finished the one for the managed natural landscape yet. So I just threw this one in here. So we have plant pictures, so the reader can get an idea of what the plants might look like. These obviously are for, a drought-tolerant landscape. And we have some character details to show some of the hardscape that they might use, like more stone or mulch or gravel and boulders, for example. So we have, I think, 22 different styles, and for each one we will have about 8 pages of information. So it's ending out to be a fairly large book, much more beyond kind of what we had envisioned initially as a kind of simple picture book for people to look at for Florida-friendly landscapes. And this is my last slide here, and I just wanted to show this to kind of show you some of the other landscape styles and what we were thinking about as far as this one, coastal landscapes, and that's an image that we're using to show kind of a typical coastal landscape. So we wanted to mimic the natural coastal landscapes that you would see, use salt-tolerant plant material, use native plants if you have a dune condition where you need to stabilize it. Palms and small trees are survive better in higher winds. So if it's an area where you have a lot of hurricanes or storms, you might want to use those types of trees, and use more natural materials such as stone and wood, because they weather nicely and they have that, will have that coastal look. Another one is a low-cost yard. And yeah, that might be kind of a weird name for a style, a landscape style, but we know we get a lot of requests for how to do a nice low-cost yard. And so we usually use primarily trees and large shrubs, just because they take up more space and it won't cost as much. You won't have to buy as many different plants. Trees with low wide canopies, because they give an illusion of having more vegetation, because if the canopy is low, you can see it in your cone of vision. And then use shrubs that have a wide spread but don't get too high, because they will fill out more space and again give that illusion of more plant material. So those are just a couple more examples of some design ideas that we are linking back to those measurable, high function, ways to measure high function. And so currently we've been working for a while on this book, and we hope to get it done in the next few months, and hope to get it in the publishing pipeline pretty soon. And I think that's it. So I don't know if we're going to take questions now or wait until Taylor does his.
We'll take them now. We'll stick with the momentum that you have.
Okay.
Take them now. Well, thank you, Gail. Just imagine 100+ people clapping and cheering, and very happy with your talk. So let's hit the questions. BJ Jarvis says, can you describe what an open fence to encourage wildlife is?
Okay, so I'll describe it by saying what a non-open fence is, basically. So you see a lot of people using stockade fences, which is a solid fence. The wood, there's no openings in the wood, and they're usually like about 6 feet tall. And so, you know, birds obviously can pass over those and squirrels can climb them, but it does inhibit the movement of a lot of smaller ground dwelling wildlife. And so what we would prefer that you use is like a split rail fence, which has just a couple posts with a rails, usually just 2 rails, very open, and any type of wildlife can move easily through it. Especially if you're in a development where you have you're next to a conservation area, or if you have a lot of people who are trying to make more wildlife friendly landscapes, you want to make sure it's open and the wildlife can move through the neighborhood or through the space.
Okay, we have a couple people volunteering to use their yard if you need any site demo locations.
Okay.
That's never a problem. Will the book be published by UF? And I guess where can people get the book when it's available?
Yes, our plan is to publish it through IFAS, through EDIS, with their book publishing. And I can tell you, I'm going through the process right now with a book that I've written with my co-author to be published by University Press. And the whole process for that book has taken 3 years to write it, to review it, and it's now in the last stages of being formatted for publishing. But the process for this book will probably be much quicker, going through the EDIS IFAS bookstore for publishing. So I don't really know when it'll be done, but we're actually pretty close to getting the book finished as far as writing it, but I don't know how quickly the publishing process will be. But it will be available through the IFAS bookstore. We hope that will be done.
Okay, you mentioned EDIS. Will it be in a series of EDIS documents, or will it be a standalone book through the IFAS bookstore?
A standalone book through the IFAS bookstore.
Okay, all right.
But we are thinking, Jen and Claire and I have discussed, and we're still needing to discuss it with Essen. I think that they have talked to her about it, but maybe posting one design on the Florida Friendly web page, one design a month, for example, just to kind of start rolling it out and getting people to see some of the designs. It won't have all the information, but at least they'll see some of the example designs.
Very cool. Does it have a title yet? Someone asks.
Not really. Florida friendly, future Florida friendly residential landscape styles. I don't know. We'll figure out a better way to say that.
Yeah. Okay. We won't pin you down on that today.
Okay.
Henry Mayer asks, well, first he says, amazing book. Is it possible to have something like the tree benefit calculator, and it's www.treebenefits.com, for the different landscapes? And this relates to a question I had, I think goes to, is there a way to quantify these different types of landscapes?
Well, there is, because all of these are, that's why we put in the measurable aspect of the different high functioning landscapes, those functional measures. But it's can be fairly complicated. So here's a couple of issues. We know about trait-based biodiversity, for example. So we could look up some of the different traits that these different plants have and say, well, that tree is high value for biodiversity because it supports 5 other species of birds, insects, whatever. But for each of these landscapes, for us to do that would take a considerable amount of time. And looking through all the resources to figure out, and that's just for measuring biodiversity based on, trait-based qualities. But for us to go back and do measurements on low maintenance, Well, we're saying low maintenance, for example, is that you have less inputs. You don't use as much fertilizer, you don't use as much pesticides or herbicides or as much water. And it would take quite a bit of time for us to calculate for each of these landscapes how much water it might use or how much fertilizer they might use and so forth. So for our purposes, we can't really go back and do all those calculations. You know, it might be something, I thought about writing an EDIS publication just to take one of these and go through all the calculations and as an example of how each of these functional measures would work and how you might apply them then to other landscapes.
Okay. Someone asks if they could get a copy of your slides. I'll just say that we're recording this and the recording will be posted. I know that's not the same thing, but can they just get in touch with you if they want a copy of your slides?
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to send them.
I don't remember who it was. Anyway, next comment, and I had a question along these lines too. This is from Deirdre Irwin. Great idea for the book. Love the thought process. We know that builders' landscape budgets would not cover this many species. Have you thought about maybe a version A that's a builder version and a version B, a more expansive version?
So this sort of goes along the line of the Tampa Bay Water Star and
Tampa Bay Waterwise.
Yes, Waterwise document that we just did. And yes, we probably could go back and with each of these styles do a version A, B, and C where we did the minimal amount of plant material, then kind of the medium, and then the max build out of plant material. And I think we could do the same thing with these particular designs too. And so just by kind of dividing up the landscape and same way we did it for the book and come up with that A, B, and C scenario.
If based on your presentation, if I understand correctly, what you have now is kind of the expansive version. It's like,
yes, yeah, that would be the full build out.
Loaded Cadillac version.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's always easy to trim.
Yes.
Sometimes harder to add. So is it easy to find native plants that are used in the book at local stores in Florida?
We actually did try to use a lot of the native plants that are more commonly used, and a lot of them actually can be found at nurseries because they just happen to be commonly used, but also native. So you can find those. And then we tried to kind of keep that in mind and make sure that our native plants could be found, you know, at native nurseries, that they were, and we don't really know about if they're locally available because we couldn't obviously check every nursery in all the different cities in Florida. That we don't know, but we made the effort to make sure they were fairly common native plants.
Someone, Tatiana Sanchez, points out that a lot of the native plant nurseries are disappearing.
Yes.
Would it be possible to include a list of available nurseries to get the plants, or working with FAN, which is the Florida Association of Native Nurseries, I believe?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then someone put the FAN link in the chat. So I don't know what your thoughts are on whether there ought to be a connection there or if it's the informal.
Well, we were kind of hesitant to put stuff like that in the book because the book will be published and it's not a living document. So those nurseries come and go a lot. So if we put that information in there, we would have to have a way to keep updating it. So, you know, we'll just put in there, check your FAN website for your local native nurseries or something like that, because you know, their website is always updated and everything.
Gotcha. Does this book supersede your current regional style guides?
Yes, it is kind of meant to be an advanced version of those style guides, because I think those style guides are getting ready to be sunsetted soon. So that was another reason why we said, you know, why don't we just do it again, but do it better and include more information rather than just going back and updating the style guides.
And it's a new way of thinking, I think, based on discussions we've had internally, how we.
Yes, and in fact, those discussions were very helpful that we had. We learned a lot about, the comments from all the members in CLU, and it was really helpful for us to kind of come up with this process and think about, well, we needed to be a little bit more future oriented when we're talking about these styles.
Let's see, did you consider pets in the landscape?
No, we didn't actually specifically consider that. We were thinking more in terms of wildlife and not necessarily pets. I think we do have one plan in there, though, that includes a dog run and how to design for a dog run out in the landscape. But, generally, we would recommend that if you want to have wildlife in your landscape, you really wouldn't want necessarily to have your cats roaming around out there. But I can't remember which particular plan it was, but it does have a dog run in there. But that was the extent of pet consideration.
Why only 2 out of 7 native shrubs in the managed natural style landscape?
Well, we might go back and relook at that and add some more native ones. But our idea was that we wanted to make sure that we had some more common landscape plants that people would recognize. And a lot of those are native, but a lot of them aren't. So we have in there, like plumbago, and I don't know, I think we had trying to remember, butterfly bush and some other ones in that particular plan. And we wanted to make sure to include those so that a homeowner could look at that and say, hey, I know that plant. I know what it looks like. And then that landscape becomes more familiar to them and they can picture it more, and they would be probably more likely to adopt or use that plan in their landscape. So we have different levels of native and non-native plants in these different styles. And we thought that having 2/3 native plants was a pretty good ratio of plants, for that particular plan, considering all the plants that we had. And then we also kind of justified it too by saying, well, all of our, almost all of our trees were native, and we know that native trees are a very high value when it comes to trait-based biodiversity. They tend to support more of the other species that we want to see in those landscapes, like our birds and our insects and, the wildlife that climb that vertical ladder and go up and down from canopy to ground level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up with one more question. Is there an introduction included to speak to new residents of what to prepare when planning and maintaining? The question is really maintaining old style traditional Florida landscapes, but maybe maintaining these particular landscapes.
Mm-hmm. Well, we do have an introduction. We have several pages in the front where we talk about how to use this book, things to think about, what's the difference between having an existing landscape and a brand new landscape, what to think about when you are looking at what plant material should I remove, what plant material should I keep, like how to do an inventory and look at what you already have and make decisions about changes you might want to make. Because a lot of people reading this book are going to have existing landscapes. They're going to have yards where and the whole idea is they kind of take a look at this and say, well, I'm getting ready to kind of maybe refresh my yard, do some new stuff in it. I want to change it up a little. I want to go more contemporary, for example. So there's a design in there for a contemporary landscape. And the whole idea is that they're not going to change your entire yard and, start fresh with a whole new contemporary landscape necessarily, but it shows them some of the style qualities of a contemporary landscape if they want to lean in that direction. And then they can pick and choose what they might want to put in their existing landscape. Or if you have a designer or a developer who, is thinking, well, I have this new development, I really want to lean toward more contemporary landscapes, this could give them some ideas on direction they might go.
Right.
And, they could hand that to their landscape architect and say, hey, here's a high functioning contemporary landscape. This is what you need to have in it to be high functioning. Maybe this can guide you a little bit in some of your design decisions.
Very good. Well, again, thank you, and appreciate that information. The applause is overwhelming at this point.
Okay, thanks.
We will use as our cue to transition to Taylor's talk. Thank you, Gail.
All right, great, thank you.
Oh man, I'm on the screen. That's not good.
Give me a minute and I'll get everything. Sharon. How's that look?
Looks good.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Taylor Clem with UF IFAS Extension in Alachua County. I'm the Environmental and Community Horticulture Agent and the Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator. Today, I want to kind of expand a little bit about what Dr. Hansen talked about, but kind of thinking of from a bigger perspective or the different scale. Because a lot of times when we think about what is that future sustainable landscape of Florida, we think of that residential landscape, but we can also think about the commercial landscapes. How does everything interconnect within a downtown urban area, or just all the green space that's all connected throughout our developed or urbanizing parts of Florida. So, and we typically call that the green fabric. So it's the green or the sustainable landscape portion of our communities. So part of my program, or what I want to speak to you all today about, is community by design. That's the name of my presentation. And it's all about participatory planning methods and extension. So it's really awesome that we can think about all these high functioning landscapes that we can use throughout the state. And then we can start to think about how can we in extension, but as other community leaders or community stakeholders, be engaged in a way in which we can start to think about the future planning and development from the entire community. So, a little bit about me, my background. I got the PhD with UF, and Dr. Hansen was my advisor. But I also have 2 degrees in landscape architecture, one from University of Kentucky, and as well as a master's from the University of Florida. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about kind of dives back in that landscape architecture and planning background, but in an overlap with kind of this idea of what is a sustainable landscape or future landscape in Florida. So let me get my PowerPoint moving. So the first thing I want to actually ask everybody a question. So if you're in any webinars with me, I always try to get you all engaged. And what I want to ask is who, and you can put this in the chat box, who plans or designs your communities? And you can put whatever your thoughts are in that chat box so I can see it. Yeah. Developers, engineers, city, yeah, planning and zoning board, money. Yeah. One person said not me, other person said wife. That's good. It's an older community, so developers, yeah, developers. So, there's a trend. So I'm seeing a lot of developers kind of pop up as a common term. So I've seen landscape architects, yeah, planners come in. But as we move through this idea of what participatory planning is, my goal is to help shift that idea that we are talking about developers and planners, but it's everybody that is within that community has a voice and should be part of that design process. So the essential question, or like at the conclusion of today's program, I want you to kind of be able to answer this question from a broad perspective. What is participatory planning and how can it be used with an extension? Or how can it be used? How can you be engaged as a stakeholder or maybe even a decision maker within your community? So I want to kind of give a little background, and this background is, we're thinking about the sustainable future. What is Florida's sustainable future? Gail was talking about the high functioning landscapes and how we're using the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program to help create these residential landscapes. And in the urban regional planning world, landscape architecture and design world, there's all these little isms, and just like briefly describe some of them. Like there's new urbanism, where the idea is like human scaled urban design that focuses on like walkability, housing, and shopping. And you'll actually see as we kind of briefly work through these, how they've almost evolved, kind of pushing that envelope a little bit further on what urbanism might be, or designed urban landscapes. The next one is green urbanism. It's creating urban areas beneficial to both humans and the environment. And there's a cool book that I really like. It's just called Green Urbanisms. Urbanism, and it's by Timothy Beatley. That's a really cool book to jump into more detail on that one. But there's also landscape urbanism, where the idea that the landscapes become the organizing element throughout urban or urbanizing areas. Rather than being defined by maybe like roadways or the buildings themselves, the landscapes become that central point of how we're thinking about how those urban landscapes are planned or organized. Next is ecological urbanism. So these are urban areas to be planned and designed based around ecological systems. So it's not just, looking at a building as a building or a park as a park, but it's really looking at how that entire urban area functions as an ecosystem. And so when we're talking about sustainability, it's really taking into account the social, economic, and environmental factors of sustainability and how everything interrelates with one another. And then lastly, there's smart growth. I added ism on there just to keep everything consistent, but it is essentially, rather than being like design, it's more that policy-based decision-making to expand economic development, create livable communities, and protect environmental resources. So these are kind of like the background of some of the things that we're seeing like evolving in urban planning. But you start to say, okay, so what? Why is that important? One of the important parts of it is that common thread that kind of connects all of them together, and that is public engagement and involvement, and that importance of having the community being part in that decision making, whether you're trying to determine how are you going to design a community space, or to how are you going to try to increase walkability through different green corridors that interconnect to different nodes throughout the city. So that public engagement is crucial. And that's where participatory planning kind of comes in. And it's essentially a strategy where you can involve the entire community in the planning, design, and problem solving process. And there's like three major kind of subject matter area experts that you would kind of bring into this participatory planning model, and that's the technical expertise, the decision makers, and then the experts in the problems. So the technical expertise, that would kind of be where extension falls, is what's that research, what are those recommendations, those solutions that we have that are science-based, and how are we using them, or how can we help lead these discussions to inform how we're going to plan and organize and think about these sustainable landscapes of the future. But that can also be like your engineers, your architects, etc. The decision makers, those are going to be, like those policy makers, those that work with local municipalities, etc. And the third is the most important, that's the experts in the problems. And those are the actual community members that live within the community, that are having to make the changes, that live the existing experiences in that urban area. And so they know what it's like, and they can really pinpoint good things, bad things, things that can be improved, things that can be reconsidered. So bringing all these people to the table and really engaging them within this design and problem solving process can really help build a community and thinking about that future sustainability. And one reason that's really important is when we think about like what that traditional model of development might be, it's these decision makers just give us a solution. And that's kind of what we saw when I asked that question at the very beginning: who's designing these spaces? You know, we got the developers, we got planners, and we didn't really have anybody mention about how we should be part of that engagement process, and how we can direct what that sustainable designs could be, or how we're going to be changing our communities throughout the future. So that's a traditional model. Whereas when we're thinking about the participatory planning method, we have our decision makers and our public, and they kind of like come together to in this process to then inform all of our new solutions, or what those designs are going to be. And again, if we're thinking about how our city's going to change, how we're going to plan on new development, you know, it's going to be important to engage everybody to really think, how are we going to solve the problems we have today with the landscape designs, and how do we solve the problems of tomorrow with the tools that we have today. And really bringing everybody together as part of that is incredibly important. But there's some really strong benefits of using this model. And it really comes down to placemaking, or place attachment, because what that does is that actually informs or can influence environmental behaviors. So when we have opportunities where we can bring people into different projects where they're helping be engaged, what they do is they have community buy-in. It develops that ownership of what's happening within their community. It gives credibility to interventions. So rather than being told, you know, this is what we're going to do, you're having a group of that within the community saying, we're going to use these strategies to solve ABC, or how we're going to design our landscapes. It's kind of giving a direction that's coming from the community, or a group, not an individual. And it develops strong community ties. So this placemaking, or that place attachment, and it's informing environmental behaviors, it's really influenced by not necessarily just that connection that individuals are having to the environment as part of this participatory planning process, but also that creation of those social networks, and creating those social norms that revolve around this community. So reestablishing that community, it allows people to apply a very strong value to a landscape or that area in which they live. So if you're going to guide participatory planning, or you're going to participate in it, you know, there's a simple process that's typically seen. You know, you have and this is a pretty standardized process for a participatory planning activity. So it's usually launch. How do you launch a project, launch an event? The second stage is really understanding what's the root of the problem, and what are the barriers that are occurring that prohibit, you know, certain environmental behaviors, or maybe that prohibit specific environmental design that occur. And then explore ideas. It's like you have an understanding of the problem, and then with that group, you're exploring the different ideas and how you can overcome them with that design and with that planning. And then you come down to decide. What's that decision has come down as a consensus from the group, and then act. What do you need to do to act going into the future? And then you can repeat as necessary, and then you continually evaluate that process. And, you know, as a good example, I have a couple examples I want to show you all, but this is what you're looking right at the image on the screen. It's not necessarily sustainable landscape design, but it's that participatory planning and action. A friend of mine named Amy Bell, she works for a Groundwork Studio in Albuquerque. She called me one day, said, "Taylor, we're doing a public event. There's this library in Bayfield, Colorado. Then they want to, as part of their community redevelopment, they want a new playground." So like, okay, how do we design a playground for a bunch of kids? So what they did is they wanted to really kind of understand what the kids liked and really explore those ideas. So they collected pallets, cardboard boxes, just a bunch of random things. And then what they did is they just let the kids explore and play and build a playground within the parking lot of this library, where the park was going to be built. So, the kids built everything, adults got involved, and it really kind of explored what that design could be by bringing in that informed decision making, but really using the youth within that discussion. So this is participatory planning, but this is just for a playground, but you can do this for an entire community. You can do this with an HOA. You can do this with a small group of homes. So the scale is very vast in how you can use participatory planning. So, and the nice thing is it's seeing that community work together is the best part of this engagement, because they are having that buy-in. You have the community working together, and it's helping direct the how this community was going to design this playground. So I want to kind of give a couple case studies where I've used this like within my extension program, and how I use participatory planning to help engage communities in making decisions with regards to Florida-friendly landscaping program. So if anybody in Alachua County, you might be familiar with the Gainesville Co-Housing. It's a smaller little community here in Gainesville, but they had a big issue on how do we create a uniform Florida-friendly landscape throughout the community. They wanted to have a strong FFL program. So what we kind of did is I went in, and that understand part of the participatory planning steps is we just had a brainstorming discussion. Let's talk about the different issues that are happening within the community, and just hear their ideas. And I just actually went out there and we just walked around the community together, and I listened and we learned. Next, we had an exploratory series of sessions where I sat down with them and we did landscape design. So I had a series of workshops where we would design different landscapes or different ideas for like the community's building throughout within the community, just to kind of learn what are the directions that they are thinking, how are they kind of see how the community would like to design what this landscape would look like. So ultimately then what they did is they decided, based off of this, they wanted to create that uniform landscape plan and adopt Florida-friendly landscaping restrictions kind of loosely within their covenants. And then they acted by, many of the homes implemented FFL principles, or they adopted it within every home within the community and within all the common spaces. And in result, they ended up becoming recognized as the outstanding Florida-friendly landscaping community. And this Gainesville Co-Housing community, this is a big project where this community ended up creating a commitment to be Florida friendly. And we accomplished that by having the community work as part of that design process, that decision-making process. And that was key to its success. And part of that is related because we had strong community leaders that were very helpful in communicating with everybody within the community, and as well as just the community's engagement and wanting to buy into the project and really seeing how it can help the community develop. The next one is a case study at Wood Creek Village. So they had an old landscape. At this point, I think it's been around, it was built in the 80s. And they wanted to implement different Florida-friendly landscaping practices throughout the landscape. So throughout their community-wide. So same thing. It's like, let's discover and let's talk and let's try to understand the full problem. So we had community walking tours. We walked all around the community looking at, common space, some of the private space, like you have this gentleman and his, in this image, he had some rainwater issues within this little courtyard area. But then we had some like knowledge-based activities where we're talking with the HOA board through presentations and discussions, as well as having some surveys, really learning what are the issues and what's the big picture and how can we make sure that we're accomplishing that and how we work with this community. So then we explored different solutions, and these solutions had to do with what's homeowner responsibility versus what's the responsibility of the commercial landscapers or those professional landscapers that help to manage that green space. So really explore those different solutions that existed within, within those roles and responsibilities. And then they decided what they ended up doing is they updated their landscape contracts to be more Florida friendly. They adopted the landscape restrictions to be Florida friendly, and they created actually a 10-year management plan on how to transition their entire landscape and community landscape to be Florida friendly. Not only on management, but also how do you retrofit a design? So taking that old landscape and updating it slowly to become Florida friendly. And currently they're in that phase 1 of that management plan. I know they've been doing some budgeting projects. And again, a key part of that is really working with those community stakeholders and really getting them engaged and involved, because especially from the extension agent, you're working with a bunch of different homeowners and communities. It's really nice to have that important person that can be kind of like a community liaison to help make this successful. So coming up towards the end, I kind of want to highlight some important things. So going back to that participatory planning, there's those 3 key areas: the technical expertise, that could come from extension, the architects, the engineers, the decision makers. So that could be an HOA board, landscape board. It can be the policy makers within your community, as well as the experts in the problem. And it's important thinking about how these people can come together to help solve the problems, no matter what the scale is, but thinking about how we can introduce Florida-friendly landscaping and other sustainable landscape practices throughout our communities. And some of those recommendations that I've created through just the experience of doing this is always identify a community leader, especially if you're trying to facilitate these participatory planning activities and extension. So identify a community leader. Who's going to be that strong person that you can communicate very easily, and they help kind of keep things moving within the community pretty well. Create a roadmap. How are you going to get from A to B? You don't know what your final step is going to be, but you start to think through that understanding process what needs to get done in order for us to develop a final plan. So having that roadmap can kind of keep everybody engaged and plugged in, and how you're going to keep working together throughout that process. And then also, it's a reiterative process. You're going to be doing it over and over again to a certain extent. You're going to repeat certain parts of those 6 steps. And it's a little bit longer process, yet it's more effective. It's a longer process because how you're trying to engage that community, help with that placemaking and attachment, but you're going to have more effective results versus coming in saying, this is how we need to make these changes within the landscape. And also within extension, act as a facilitator, bring in those additional technical expertise. So I really like this came on the right from an extension publication from the University of Kentucky, one of their landscape architecture professors, Jo Young Koo, and in her placemaking publication, one of the first statements that she said on how to create placemaking, it says, when designing public spaces, communities should listen to the needs of their community members. And that's important because if you're thinking about how we're going to make these lasting changes, it's going to be important for us to really consider the community and who we're designing for or working with to make sure that those communities are effective. So going back, what is participatory planning? This is that essential question. What is participatory planning? How can it be used with an extension? You should be able to comfortably see how that can be used. If you're not extension, how can you participate in this as a stakeholder, a decision maker, et cetera? And then, final thoughts. The community by design is kind of a double meaning. So the community by design is designing better communities for Florida's future. That's the idea, is how are we taking the sustainable landscape ideas, these highly functional landscapes, and creating these local and regional landscapes that are effective and sustainable. But then also that other meaning is building community through design. So that is rebuilding that community, and with that place attachment, to have a stronger community where people are engaged and more reflective on what's happening around them. And then its impacts on pro-environmental behaviors. So to conclude my portion of the presentation, again, I want you to put your thoughts in the chat box, is how do you see participatory planning being used within your professional field? You know, it can be a simple, you know, sentence or a statement, but how do you see participatory planning being used within your professional field? Excellent. So, and use it in the design of their parks and different streetscapes. Yeah. A common way to do participatory planning with urban designers is like, you know, walkability. Where do people like to walk? Where they not like to walk? What makes them safe? How to improve safety? And a lot of that actually has to do with, or part of it has to do with horticulture, as with regards to like street trees, safety. Is it comfortable to be within? So, anyways, so I want to thank everybody. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me, and I can give you some more information on documents with regarding participatory planning and how it's used within extension.
Great, thanks, Taylor. I think you asked how are you using it in your professional world, and not too many comments on that. I mean, people are probably still typing, but maybe the reality is it's not used all that often.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, how do we make that happen? I mean, how can we encourage that to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a true statement. Is there's a lot of designs decisions that happen in isolation from the community in which it impacts. And really from the public perspective, it's really engaging those community leaders and how can we be involved or what can we do? I know that City of Gainesville has done some participatory planning activities in the past as part of their economic development. And there's other facilitated guides, but I think that's also becomes an opportunity for extension, because that's how, you know, with myself or other extension agents have that opportunity to help facilitate participatory planning as part of that decision-making process for developing and urbanizing, especially our urbanizing counties.
Yep, we have a comment here. In Tallahassee, developers have all the power. They clear cut sites, impose their own will on the public, and they do not have local roots. We see that all too often. It's not Tallahassee, it's all over the place.
Yeah. I think one way to really kind of think about how a voice can be important in that type of situation is, you know, when communities have to update their unified land development code, that becomes a great opportunity for those communities to really reach out to their public and say, how do we address these issues? Because every community has to update those comprehensive plans. So for communities, that's an ideal time to really, how do you bring in your community to help paint the picture for long-term development standards within that community?
Right, good input. Pierce asks, can you describe the irrigation systems used in the Gainesville co-housing? And then he goes on to ask, do they have any on-site wells?
I'd have to double check. I do not think they have an on-site well. I think their irrigation is all part of reclaimed. But Pierce, I'll double check with you, but everything there is micro irrigation throughout the homes, but most of them are turned off anyways. So they're very vigilant on turning off their irrigation systems and only irrigating during times of drought or during plant establishment.
Yep, that was going to be my guess looking at the photo you showed.
Yeah.
Micro or maybe nothing.
Yeah, a lot of areas they do have nothing. A lot of them they will use just they use like the misters, and then they just remove them or close them off pretty easily when they're not being used.
Here's a good question about logistics of participatory planning. How much time you have and budget plays a big part of it.
Yes, that's absolutely true. So, you know, like the playground, example that I gave, that had zero budget. It was like a guerrilla participatory planning exercise where they just put a call to the community. It said, here's these big items that we want, bring them. and like there was no shortage on pallets and cardboard boxes. People bought paint. So that was kind of a really neat opportunity. But I mean, at the same time, the city was paying that architecture and landscape architecture firm to do that event. So that's a cost that's associated with it as part of that design services. So when the community hired them as part of the design services for that playground, as well as the other planning for that community, they had certain things written to the contract to do participatory planning or other planning activities with the community.
I wonder, how did kids covered in cardboard armor and wooden swords, how did that translate to design of their playground?
That's a very good question. I don't know how that ended up translating directly, but I think I wanted to put that picture in there because it showed that importance of sense of play in development and planning. Because what they're showing is that kids have the ability to engage with I mean, they're essentially using cardboard.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
can play. So the idea is, how are these kids playing with that? And I mean, they could translate it. You know, one of the things that they did have, there's like a medieval theme that ended up going throughout the playground when they were building it. One little fort had a drawbridge. So, you know, they could have translated into trying to do some type of medieval castle as part of that landscape or that playground design.
Or they just could have bought a whole bunch of cardboard boxes and let the kids go to town.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of like you buy your kid or your cat or whatever a toy, and they play with the box that you get it in.
Yeah. Yeah. My cat prefers bottle caps versus his toys. So,
All right. Barbara McAdams says this process is being used in Miami-Dade County, but there's some concern that it could become political.
So yes, and that's can be very difficult, and that comes from the facilitator's perspective. Is when you're trying to create who comes to this community, who's engaging in this participatory planning, you need to get as many people or the important people that's impacted by this project at the table. The minute that there's certain unrepresented groups, you're not doing it appropriately. So the larger the project, the harder it is.
Mhm.
So typically what you're having to do is you're doing the participatory planning activities multiple times to try to bring in as many people as possible to get as much input. Because yeah, if you don't get all the voices, if you don't get the right people involved and people are isolated, then it can get concerning.
It's difficult and time consuming. That's why people don't do it.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah.
Is there some participatory planning experience of landscape interventions at UF?
What kind of landscape interventions? That's
That's the question.
yeah. Here's my resources that I had on here.
And people can reach out to you.
Yeah, I'd like to get some more information on that question. But you know, when I think about landscape interventions, like the Gainesville co-housing, that's participatory planning, as well as, I mean, both those case stories, those were interventions on how are we going to manage these landscapes, and what can we do to change them. So, you know, if we want to do something like what's on US campus or what's been done, I'm not entirely sure, but
Yeah, here's a good comment. I participated in planning for entries to our development, and then the HOA decided to replace our decisions with plants that were cheaper. That doesn't sound like true participatory planning.
correct. Yeah. So when you create that decide and act, when you're facilitating, you know, when you're working like with an HOA, it's like you're going through this process. They're part of that discussion. So that decision that's made, that's the decision of the group, and that's what needs to be acted. The minute that in a situation where someone's like, now we're going to do something different, that completely disregards the entire reason for doing that planning activity. So of course it always needs to be, you know, when you're thinking about those HOAs, it's like, well, we need to make sure it's affordable. You know, that needs to be that's an important point as part of that participatory planning, is you're juggling that into that discussion as well.
Doris Heitzman asked, did you ever try a focus group first? And if so, what were the age groups?
So it depends. So I've done focus groups before on other events. And so it's always based off of pretty much the user. Who do you think the user is going to be? It's not necessarily extension, but one time I was doing a focus group for a mini golf course that I was helping design, and we had a focus group that was specifically with kids. You know, what would be a fun mini golf course? And then we also had one with adults, like what would entice adults to bring their families to this mini golf course. So it really depends on who that target audience is and what you'd like to learn from them. So yes, I've done focus groups, but that's to target very specific groups. And that can sometimes also be very beneficial because it helps you kind of learn, okay, here's the big picture. So then when you go to the community, you at least have a framework that you can learn more about it.
Let's see, and there's a bunch of comments here, people who have used various elements of participatory planning, from folks with the county, Stacy with the county, and a number of agents have experience with this. Let's see. Gail points out that people can. This is with respect to that UF comment. We weren't sure whether it was a specifically for UF campus question or just experience of us at UF. Anyhow, people can attend the LVL committee. I believe that's land, vegetation, lakes, something like that.
Yeah, lakes.
Okay. Committee and committee meetings and make comments. So those meetings are noticed, I guess, publicly. And then, as Gail points out, not true participatory planning, but you can make your voices heard. Mm-hmm. Let's see, any more questions? Lakes, Vegetation, and Landscaping Committee. Thank you, Gail.
So yeah, and there are certain times when, you know, obviously with like an LVL committee, or if you're working with a county commission or anything like that, that obviously there's points that they're making, they're finalizing those decisions. And what's happening leading up to a lot of those meetings are those participatory planning activities. So a great example is if like you are doing a unified land development code, how are you adopting these Florida-friendly landscapes into that ULDC? And that's all happening. And then once that final decision is made, and as part of that act, it's like, okay, now this goes to the county commission or the city to kind of say, give final approval and put it in stone. So sometimes a lot of this happens before you get to that point anyways.
Right. Okay, it looks like the questions have tapered off. I think that's it. We'll end 6 minutes early. Thank you both.
Y'all get an early afternoon.
Yeah. I'm gonna do a lot of that 6 minutes. Well, thanks to everyone who attended. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Gail. Really appreciate you coming on today and talking about this. This is an important topic. You know, what we're talking about today will shape Florida, you know, decades into the future. So I am convinced we're doing very important work. Can you hear me over the applause or what?
It's ringing in my ears.
There you go. All right.
Need a sound button.
And everyone out there, tune in next week. We have another installment. We'll be over halfway next week. We're about halfway now. So come on back for more stuff. Thank you all.
Take care.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.